Part 3, Moscow. Moyasik was nothing but a vast hospital. Generals, officers, privates all arrived there seeking the help which none could give. The army continued its movement until September 11th. Marshal Ney, in command of the advance guard, was 5 leagues from Moyasik, along the road to Moscow, and the King of Naples a little further on. This retreat resulted in only a few prisoners. The emperor had halted to give the troops some rest and to carry out the reorganization necessary in case there should be a second battle. On the 13th, when the whole army was again on the move, the emperor halted all the columns. Our cavalry were so exhausted that they could not push their reconnaissance to any distance, and the moment we knew so little of the enemy's movement that, doubtful as to the direction taken by Kutuzov, of whom there was no news, the emperor judged it advisable to pause. He had not received any reports from Prince Poniatowski on our right, and was for a moment uneasy about him, since he felt that the Russians might have taken advantage of our rest to fall upon us from the side and threaten our flank and rear in the hope of stopping, or at least delaying, our entry into Moscow until they had received replies from Petersburg. The emperor still inferred that the enemy desired to propose a settlement whilst offering battle too. Officers were sent out one after the other in all directions. The King of Naples was ordered to make a strong reconnaissance along the Kaluga road. At last the emperor was reassured, and the army resumed its march. He was delighted to learn that the enemy, encumbered with wounded and baggage, were taking the Moscow road, where, according to various reports, outworks had been thrown up in preparation for a second battle. The Prince of Neuchatel told me that the emperor was amazed at the King of Naples receiving no proposal from the enemy, who, notwithstanding their reinforcement by the militia and the recruits, had done nothing to put themselves in an attitude of defense. From that he inferred, and he repeated it more than once, that the Russian army had lost far more heavily at Borodino than had been supposed, and that it would be in no position to continue the campaign that year. Since the battle, the emperor had spoken to scarcely one of his entourage. He seemed to be in continual anxiety. At 10 o'clock in the morning of the 14th, the emperor was on the heights overlooking Moscow, called the Sparrow Hills, when he received a note from the King of Naples informing him that the enemy had evacuated the city and that a Russian staff officer had been sent with a flag of truce to ask for a suspension of hostilities while the troops were crossing the city. The emperor agreed to this, but ordered the king to follow the Russians step by step, to force them as far away as possible, once they were outside the barriers. He likewise enjoined him not to enter the city, but to go around it, if he could. He instructed the king to send him as soon as might be a deputation of the city authorities, who were to meet him at the city gate. Shortly afterwards, he ordered General Durolnel, whom he had appointed governor, to enter the city with as many picked gendarmes as he could muster, establish order there, and take possession of the public buildings. He urged him particularly to maintain order, to guard the Kremlin, and to keep him supplied with information. The general was especially enjoined to hasten the deputation of city authorities which the King of Naples was to collect. This, the emperor said, would give the inhabitants of the town the best possible guarantee for their tranquility. Not imagining for a moment that this deputation would fail to appear or that he would receive no news, a natural omission, considering the distance to be covered, the emperor reached the barrier of the moat at noon and dismounted there. He grew impatient. He sent out fresh officers every minute, and he kept calling for a deputation or some citizens of note. At last, one after the other, reports came from the king and General Durolnel. Far from having found any of the civic authorities, they had not been discovered so much as a single prominent inhabitant. All had fled. Moscow was a deserted city where one came across none but a few wretches of the lowest class. Step by step, the King of Naples followed the retreat of the enemy's rear guard, and the Russian officer in command could not speak highly enough of his courage, though he protested against His Majesty's temerity. "Such is our admiration of you," he said, "that our Cossacks have passed word round that no one is to fire a shot at so brave a prince. However, one of these days," he added, "you will meet with misfortune." He urged the king to be sparing of courage so fine as his. A certain amount of time was gained in the exchange of such compliments, and they were dispensed all the more lavishly, as the king seemed to welcome them. Wishing to make some gift to so courteous a foe, his majesty asked his staff if one of them could not lend him some piece of jewelry. Monsieur Gargot, the orderly officer who was attending him in order to carry out the emperor's scheme of liaison, offered his repeater, which the king hastened to present to the Cossack officer. While waiting for information, the emperor had spent his time in reconnoitering in various directions. The hills were commanded Moscow on that side. When he returned to the gate of the city, he ordered me to write to the Arch-Chancellor in Paris and the Duke of Bissono at Vilna, informing them that we were at Moscow, and dating my letter from that city. He placed pickets to prevent any soldier from entering the place, but there were so many gaps in the walls that this precaution was of little avail. In the town itself, a few shots were exchanged with armed peasants, stragglers from the Russian army, and Cossacks, who were met with everywhere. As was the case in most of the private palaces, nothing had been disturbed in the Kremlin. Even the clocks were still going, as though the rightful owners were in occupation. A few Russian stragglers caused some disorder. Men were constantly being caught, but the gendarmes at Monsieur Duranel's disposal were quite insufficient to cope with them. So he confined his attention to the Kremlin and the orphanage, which he kept intact. He asked the emperor for more troops, informing him that all the houses were full of stragglers and deserters, and that, in view of the great size of the city, he must not think of making an entrance until a number of the houses had been searched and a proper system of patrols established in every quarter. The emperor instructed him to apply to the Duke of Treviso, whose corps was to occupy the town. But the Duke's forces were greatly reduced in strength, and as he did not see the need of scattering his men so soon, and at nightfall besides, he sent only a meager and insufficient number to Duranel. As I have already remarked, the well-to-do inhabitants had fled. All the authorities had left the place, which was entirely deserted. There was no possibility even of getting together any kind of administrative service. No one remained but a few Uchitets, French tutors, a few foreign shopkeepers, the servants in some of the hotels, and for the rest, people of the lowest classes of society. It would be difficult to describe the impression made on the emperor by this news. Never have I seen him so deeply impressed. He was already greatly disturbed and impatient at having had to wait for 2 hours at the city gate, and this report undoubtedly plunged him into the gravest reflections. His face, normally so impassive, showed instantly and unmistakably the mark of his bitter disappointment. Count Duranel had kept sending information to the emperor as fast as he gathered it, and this completely confirmed what had already come through. Monsieur Rostopchin, the governor of Moscow, had not left the city until 11 o'clock that same morning, after having sent off the officials, the whole administrative staff, and the population. A very small number of householders and some 1,000 or so of the people of the lowest classes had stayed behind, simply because they did not belong to overlords and because their ignorance prevented them from knowing where to go. Most of the houses were as deserted as the streets. The governor had kept from the inhabitants any news of the loss of the battle, and had not even said anything about the projected evacuation of the town until the last moment. Only a small portion of the archives and valuables could be taken away. Some arms remained in the arsenal, and a few soldiers and militia were hidden in the houses. These men were armed, and the militia were little better than savages. Duranel accordingly urged the emperor once again not to enter the city. Yet, especially at the difficulty of making oneself understood, and even of finding guides or obtaining intelligent information, involved the waste of considerable time. He stayed near the bridge all night, his headquarters being established in the mean tavern built of wood at the entrance to the suburb. The king of Naples, who was in pursuit of the enemy, sent word to the emperor that numerous stragglers were being caught, and that they all said the army was being disbanded, that the Cossacks openly declared that they would fight no more, and that the army was headed for Kazan. He confirmed what had been learned in the city, that Kutuzov had kept silence as to the loss of the battle and the retreat on Moscow until the previous day, and that the authorities and inhabitants of the city had taken flight that same evening. And even on the day of our arrival, he told us that the governor, Rotovchin, had not heard of the loss of the battle until 48 hours before our entry into Moscow. That up until that moment, Marshal Kutuzov had talked of nothing but success, of his skillful maneuvering, and the damage he had done to the French. The King of Naples confidently expected to seize part of the enemy convoys, and felt certain of being able to break up their rear guard. So completely disheartened did he believe the Russians to be. He repeated these particulars in all his dispatches, and likewise insisted that the Cossacks were demoralized and were on the point of quitting the Russian army. All these details delighted the emperor and restored his cheerfulness. He had not received any proposals at the gates of Moscow, but the actual state of the Russian army, its discouragement, the discontent of the Cossacks, the impression certain to be caused by Petersburg by the news of the occupation of the second capital of Russia. All the happenings which Kutuzov had doubtless concealed from the Tsar, just as he had kept them from Rostopchin, all these things, said the emperor, must surely lead to peace proposals. He made no comment on Kutuzov's march on Kazan. About 11 o'clock in the evening, news came that the bazaar was on fire. The Duke of Treviso and Count Duranel went to the spot, but in the darkness it was impossible to cope with this conflagration, for there was nothing at hand, and no one knew where to find pumps and hoses. The inhabitants and soldiers pillaged such shops as they had time to enter. During the night, there were 2 small outbreaks of fire in the suburbs also, at some distance from that where the emperor was quartered, but they were attributed to carelessness in lighting campfires, and orders were given to redouble vigilance. These accidents having no immediate sequel, little importance was attached to them. The guard was ordered to furnish sentry posts for various points. The Duke of Treviso and Monsieur Duranel, who were constantly in the saddle, did all they could to ensure the tranquility of the vast city.